start that recording now. But again, thank you so much to everyone who's tuned in on the call tonight, and a great big welcome. Thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join us for this special topic around sharing myths and legends across cultures. We're grateful for you to be here. My name's Crystal. I'm the director of the visitor program. So for anyone who's tuned in for a virtual event in the past, welcome back. For anyone who this is your first virtual event that you're joining us for, thank you so much for your time. We're grateful you're here. And also just to give you a quick overview or some context around our virtual events, our visitor program was paused in March of 2020 due to COVID, but there was still an interest from folks to connect and to learn from one another. And so Heidi Schleif, Terry Wong, Eleazar, and others worked really hard to identify some opportunities for that to continue. And so for about a year or so now, we've been hosting virtual events on a variety of different topics. And we've seen a really positive impact from that. So we'll continue to offer virtual events in the future, even when the visitor program reopens in January of 2022. So if you have any ideas for topics, if you have any feedback, please don't hesitate to share. We would love to hear from you.
Thank you, dear.
Oh, you're very
Oh,
welcome.
sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't know my mic was on.
That's okay.
Wrong gear.
Yeah. In terms of kind of what to expect for tonight, one of the goals with this topic in particular was to provide an opportunity for that cultural exchange. And so any story that's shared in Spanish or Quechua is interpreted to English, and any questions, comments, stories in English will be interpreted back to Spanish. And so in terms of what that means, we're going to have some intentional time and space for Carla, who's interpreting this evening, to catch folks up, and she's likely doing that now as I'm sharing that welcome. So a great big shout out and thank you to Carla for interpreting tonight. Thank you to Eleazar for providing tech support, to our planning committee and everybody who has been involved with making this virtual event possible. Of course, thank you to our gracious storytellers, and to all of you for joining us this evening. In terms of housekeeping, we're going to ask folks to mute their mic while the stories are being told, but please continue to engage with the chat box. So ask questions, share comments. We'll intentionally leave some time at the end of the event as well for anyone to chime in with an anecdote or a story or a question for any of our presenters. So if you would like to make the speaker larger in your screen, what you can do is go in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. You'll see 3 dots there. You can right-click on that and pin the speaker. That will enlarge whoever is talking at that time. And like I mentioned, thanks to our gracious storytellers, we have 3 folks who are joining us tonight who are going to share stories from both San Lucas and from the US. So we have Alba, who's going to share the story of La Llorona. We have Paul, who's going to talk about Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. And Alberto is going to speak to the story of the Spirit of the Lake. But before we dive in, we also wanted to provide a little bit of context around the why behind this topic in particular. So like I mentioned, part of the purpose of this topic is for that opportunity for cultural exchange and for all of the content to be shared in both Spanish and English. Part of the purpose is to come together in a fun and meaningful and engaging way. Who doesn't love a good story? And part of it is to really highlight the importance of storytelling, of folk tales, of oral traditions as it relates to cultural transmission. And so to highlight that a little bit further, before we get started, I wanted to share a couple of excerpts from an email that Father Greg sent to student back in 2004. So we recently came across this message as part of an archive project. I won't share the whole email since we don't have the full context around that conversation or what the requests look like, but there was some really interesting pieces that I wanted to pass along to you all tonight before we get started. So in the message, Father Greg says, folk tales are still commonly told, and oral tradition is still very important. Mostly, they're told by the grandparents to the children and young adults who will take the time to listen. The grandparents, who are seen in our culture as the wisdom people, love to tell tales, and many times they add a little of their own interpretation, an important part of folk tale telling. They like to get themselves and their lives a bit involved in the tale being told. And Carla, I realize I just spoke a lot. I don't know if you need a little bit of time um, to interpret for folks there, or if you've been doing that as I've been talking. Okay, I'll continue. Carla also has Father Greg's email, and so she can share that with folks then too.
Mi micrófono no se escucha, pienso.
Okay.
Me?
So
I can say it now.
What's that?
Yeah. If you want, I can do the translation now.
Okay, sounds good.
Ok. Padre Gregorio escribió un correo electrónico. Él decía que las historias, las leyendas, son historias muy comunes aquí para contar en la tradición, que son muy importantes, porque son contadas a través de los abuelos. Y los abuelos se los cuentan a los niños y a los adultos, quienes toman el tiempo para escucharlo. Los abuelos transmiten la cultura y transmiten también su conocimiento, su inteligencia, y a ellos les gusta contar leyendas.
All right. In the email, Father Greg goes on to share some anecdotes and stories from community members. He says folk tales are a most important part of cultural transmission, probably the most important part, and they deal mostly with history. And from history, these stories deal with the why such things should be done today, like planting corn, how, when, etc., how the moon will affect so many aspects of life, the birth of a child, planting, cutting down trees only when needed, etc. The folk tales become the proof for the wisdom being passed on to the young by the aged.
En el correo que escribió Padre Gregorio también compartió algunas anécdotas, unas historias de la comunidad, de los miembros de esta comunidad. Él decía de que las leyendas sirven para transmitir probablemente lo más importante o la parte más importante era contar la historia. Y las historias también que de las cosas que se hacían, como por ejemplo cuando se cultivaba el maíz, cómo el cambio de luna o los efectos de luna afectaban también parte de la naturaleza. También él decía de que a través de las leyendas la gente compartía su inteligencia, su sabiduría y pasaba esta sabiduría para las personas jóvenes.
Thank you, Carla. Father Greg continues his message by saying most of the stories relate to agriculture, family, and community relationships, explanations for strange things that might happen in a family or in a community. There's almost always some relationship with nature. In the email, he also touched on the importance of trees in Maya culture. Father Greg goes on to say, a person for Mayans is an integral part of creation, and live life, alongside all other living things in our natural surroundings. Nature is not controlled, nature is lived with by human beings.
También en el correo, Padre Gregorio continuaba diciendo de que la mayoría de historias estaban relacionadas con la cultura, las familias y la relación que tenían con la comunidad. Explicaba cosas extrañas que quizás pasaban en las familias o en la comunidad, pero que todo tenía mucha relación con la naturaleza. En el correo, él también tocaba puntos importantes de que la naturaleza, los árboles eran muy importantes para la cultura maya. Padre Gregorio decía que una persona maya es parte integral de la creación. Que la naturaleza no es que esté alrededor de nosotros, sino que es parte del ser humano.
Father Greg closes the message by saying, folk tales are of utmost importance for cultural transmission. And so with that, we welcome our storytellers who will share myths, legends, and tales from both Guatemala and the United States.
Ya para terminar el correo de Padre Gregorio, él decía en su mensaje que las leyendas son parte importante de la transmisión de la cultura. Y por eso ahora le damos la bienvenida a nuestros historiadores, quienes van a compartir mitos y leyendas de ambos lugares, de Guatemala y de Estados Unidos.
All right, take it away, Elba.
Buenas tardes a cada uno de ustedes. Bienvenidos a este lugar. Reciban un cordial saludo del pueblo de San Lucas Tolimán. Nos sentimos.
Good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to this place and welcome to San Lucas Tolimán.
Nos sentimos muy felices al compartir estas historias o leyendas que sí han sucedido. Esperamos que les gusten.
We are so happy to share with you these legends and myths that have happened here in San Lucas. We hope that you enjoy those.
Mi nombre es Elba Cecilia Macal Monroy.
My name is Elvia Cecilia Macal Monroy.
Trabajo en el programa de educación en el Colegio Monseñor Gregorio.
I'm working in the education program at school Monseñor Gregorio.
Xkajqij Juntir Kawinak Kachalar Lisco Estados Unidos. Chinechinen Kinukush in Kowera in Tioshit Katata Kochika que Shuya Jun Qij más Zaka. Entonces,
Good afternoon, everybody. I am so happy to stay here and I thanks my God, my Father, to give us another day to stay here with you.
y como Haren Bih Kinukush in Kowera y en Kachinech Nibir Kae Oshi hasta Kaje Hakib Anon Kana Kate Katata, Hakibin Kana Kate Katata Chaka, Harich Kohon Kair Wakare Nkah que Tikach Chiwach, lo que hosta Kabir.
I am so happy to stay here and I can tell you one thing, another thing, and more things about our culture. And I really hope that you like it and you enjoy it because it is part of our culture.
And then, where she gave San Lucas, y de Katiepos, and then Manon pues seguir juntir Kinkibir Kateca de Tachaka y Malchos Chicha Chica que en Coera y Choca en Waka en Co y Samaj para Misión San Lucas y en Cochupa un programa construcción.
I born here in San Lucas and I am forming part I grew here in San Lucas, so I know a lot of things about culture, myths, and legends. Now I am so happy to share with you those things. And also, I tell you that I am working in the mission.
Bueno, no vienen Alberto Jacinto Ajuac.
My name is Alberto Jacinto Ajuac.
Y Jumbiachik Kajij.
And again, I say to you, good afternoon.
Yo vengo a hablarles de una historia de la Llorona, la cual la vivió mi señor padre.
I am here with you to share the legend about the Llorona. It was part of the story that my father lived.
Según cuenta la historia de que la Llorona es una mujer que sus hijos se le ahogaron y por eso es que ella sale a buscarlos en las noches para ver si los encuentra, asustando a la gente con su grito de mucha tristeza.
The Llorona story is about a woman with her soul in pain. He goes or walks in the street crying for her children because they died.
La historia que yo les vengo a contar es esta. En el año de 1944, habían dos jóvenes que se llamaban Jesús, que era mi padre, y su amigo Mario.
On the year 1944 is the year of this story happened. And this story is about my father named Jesus and one of his friends named Mario.
Mario tenía una novia que se llamaba Marta.
Mario had a girlfriend. Her name was Marta.
Pero Jesús estaba prestando su servicio militar en Sololá.
Jesus was in the army in Sololá.
Un día vino y fue a visitar a su hermano, a su amigo Mario. Y su amigo Mario dijo, me acompañó noche de no verla.
One day, Jesus came home to visit his friend Mario. Mario invites him to visit his girlfriend at night because there is a lot of time since they haven't seen.
Como a eso de las 9:30 de la noche, fue para con la quien cementerio.
At 9:13, Jesus and Mario went to visit the girl, Marta. She lived in one of the streets close to the cemetery.
Pero como los novios antes y todavía en la actualidad, ellos se comunican se comunicaban por medio de flidos.
Before, here in the community, when you have a relationship and if you want to call to the girl, you needed to whistle in front or close to her house.
Entonces se fueron y Mario va de chiflar a su novia y a su novia que era Marta, y Marta no salía.
Mario was whistling to Marta, but Marta didn't come out.
Entonces le dijo Mario a Jesús, ¿por qué será que no sale?
Then Mario asked Jesus, why Marta don't come out?
Pero como estaban en esa calle del cementerio, Jesús volteó a ver para la puerta del cementerio y había una mujer parada ahí en esa puerta.
They were close to the cemetery street. So then Jesus turned his head in the other street, and in front of the cemetery door was a lady.
Entonces Mario le dijo, venite, vamos allá con ella. Y encaminaron sus pasos, pero entre más ellos se iban acercando a la mujer, ellos sintieron un frío muy raro y se les pusieron los pies bien pesados.
Mario said to Jesus, "Let's go, walk towards the woman." But before they reached, they felt fear and chills.
Entonces ellos llegaron a donde estaba la mujer en la puerta del cementerio, pero cuando vieron que tenía el pelo sobre la cara,
So then they come close to the gear in the cemetery, but then they could see that the women had the hair over his face.
entonces el uno al otro le dijo, esta es la Llorona.
So they realized that it was the Llorona.
Y se echaron a correr los dos.
They began to run.
Pasaron corriendo toda la calle del mercado,
They ran down all the street of the market.
donde hoy es el Instituto Eduardo Díaz,
Now we can find the Instituto Eduardo Díaz in that street.
y se atravesaron todo el parque.
Also, they ran all the Park Street
porque Mario vivía hasta en el sector que hoy se llama El Relleno.
because Mario was living at the place named El Relleno.
Pero ellos iban corriendo y miraban para atrás.
They were running fast, but they turned their head and they looked at the Llorona behind them.
Y lo que ellos miraban era que entre más corrían, la mujer estaba más cerca de ellos.
They ran faster, and the Llorona was getting close to them.
Cuando se dieron cuenta, ya iban llegando a la casa de Mario, entonces Mario le dijo a Jesús, no vayamos a tocar la puerta de la casa porque no nos van a abrir rápido.
They were arriving at the Mario's house, but Mario says, Jesus, that we don't knock the door because maybe nobody is going to open us.
Porque no nos van a abrir rápido y ella nos va a alcanzar.
And the Llorona can catch us.
Entonces le dijo, nos metamos a la troja donde mi papá guarda el maíz.
So they ran and they said, we can stay here in a storage building but by corn cane.
Las trojas eran unas bodegas construidas de la misma caña de la milpa y las utilizaban directamente para guardar el maíz.
The trojas were storage building with corn, and they used that storage to keep the corn.
Entonces ellos adentro de la troja, ellos se daban cuenta que la mujer llegó hasta donde ellos estaban y le daba vuelta a la troja, pero ya no pudo entrar donde ellos estaban.
They hide in the troja or the storage, and they could see that the Llorona was walking around that house.
Entonces, Mario le dijo a Jesús, definitivamente no te vas a poder ir, porque no le dijo Jesús, porque puede estar allá afuera y me puede agarrar. Tenía miedo.
So Mario said, Jesus, you will not go home because maybe the Llorona is outside, and they were afraid.
A todo esto eran de 2 a 3 de la mañana.
It was like 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning.
Y Jesús salió de ahí de esa troja hasta las 5. Se pudo ir para su casa ya seguro de que no la iba a encontrar.
And Jesus went to his house at 5 o'clock in the morning because he was sure he would not find the Llorona in the street.
Bueno. Con esto termino esta historia de lo que es la Llorona y espero que les guste a todos.
I finished my story about the Llorona, and I really hope that you enjoyed and liked it.
Thank you so much, Alba. That was wonderful. Well, spooky, but it was great. So thank you for sharing. All right, next up we have Paul, who's going to be talking about Paul.
Indeed, I am. It's a delight to be with you all of my friends, all of our friends here in this country and also in Guatemala. Thank you all for being part of this great exchange of stories and of friendship. I'm very happy to be a part of it. I'll let you interpret that, Carla.
Yes, sorry. Él dice que buenas tardes a todos, que para él es un honor estar compartiendo la historia a sus amigos allá en los Estados Unidos y también a sus amigos aquí en San Lucas, que entonces que espera que podamos disfrutar de la historia que él nos va a contar.
So first of all, about this man named Paul Bunyan. Paul Bunyan was, of course, a mythical person, but historians believe he was based in large part on an actual lumberjack, a Canadian. This was a large man that had giant hands, and he led a rough and tumble life. And it was this life and his murder in 1875 that fueled the tales about him that were told throughout logging camps across the Midwest part of America.
¿Ya? Él nos está contando una historia que es sobre Paul Bunyan, que es una persona mítica, pero los historiadores creen que se basó en una gran parte de un leñador real, que era un tipo llamado Fabian Froner, un canadiense, que era realmente un hombre grande, con manos grandes, muy grandes. Él llevó una vida muy dura y fue esta vida y tal vez lo asesinaron en 1875. Y las historias fueron relatadas en los campamentos de madera de parte del superior, del medio superior del oeste para América. Hay historias contradictorias sobre el lugar de donde nació. Algunos dicen que nació en Virginia, Minnesota, y otros dicen que fue en Bangor, pero él decía que era de Minnesota.
Yes, and Carla, that last paragraph, I'm going to interpret that in English for our folks here. There are actually conflicting stories about where Paul Bunyan was born. Some say it was Bemidji, Minnesota. Some say it was Bangor, Maine. But since I'm from Minnesota and I have a lake home near Bemidji, that's the one I'm going with. He's from Bemidji. So I'm going to share my screen now because I'd like you to see the pictures of the story that I'm going to be telling. Let's see if I can do that.
Dice de que él va a compartir ahora la imagen en su computadora para que podamos ver los dibujos mientras él está contando la historia.
Here's the story. When this country was young, the forest stretched as far as the eye could see. People wanted open land for planting crops, and they wanted wood for building houses. They needed lumberjacks. The lumberjacks worked hard in the deep woods. They chopped down trees and they hauled logs until the stars came out. And then they sat around a crackling campfire and told stories of old logging days when everything was extra big, even the men. And of course, they remembered the biggest, strongest lumberjack of them all, Paul Bunyan.
Ok, él está compartiendo entonces la pantalla y podemos ver ahí, empieza la historia y dice, cuando este país era joven, los bosques se extendían hasta donde alcanzaba la vista. La gente quería terrenos abiertos o planos para cultivos. Querían madera para construir casas. Entonces ellos necesitaban a los leñadores. Los leñadores trabajaron duro para poder despejar los bosques. Ellos cortaron árboles y troncos hasta que ellos cortaban árboles y troncos hasta que salieran las estrellas. Luego se sentaban alrededor de una fogata y contaban historias de los viejos tiempos de la tala, incluso los hombres. Y por supuesto, recordaban al leñador más grande y fuerte de todos ellos, Paul Bunyan.
Some folks say Paul Bunyan was the biggest baby ever born. It took 5 giant storks to deliver him to his parents. And the first time he cried, the birds fell out of the trees. And after that, all the forest critters wore earmuffs.
Algunas personas dicen que Paul Bunyan fue el bebé más grande que jamás había nacido, que tuvieron que tener 5 cigüeñas gigantes para entregárselos a sus padres. La primera vez que él lloró, los pájaros se caían del árbol. Después de eso, todas las criaturas del bosque tuvieron que usar tapaorejas para no escuchar.
It's hard to tell the story without laughing, isn't it, Carla? Paul kept growing and growing and growing. It sure was hard to keep that boy fed. Every morning, his mother cooked up a dozen eggs and 10 pots of oatmeal. And after that little snack, Paul was ready for breakfast. His parents also worked hard to keep him in clothes. Once a month, his father carved a new pair of shoes from 2 pine trees. His mother used the wool from a whole flock of sheep to knit her son a sweater. And how did she make the buttons? She sewed on wheels from a wagon. Are you there, Carla? This is going to be a problem if I'm going to be translating. Looks like we might have lost a connection.
Paul, I think you could continue with this story knowing that Carla has the story in front of her and she could fill folks in when they're
okay
done.
Right. Just to amplify what Crystal is saying, she has the same script that we have here, so she can interpret at her convenience.
Sure, I am ready.
Oh, you're
Paul,
back.
yeah. Paul siguió creciendo y creciendo. Y seguro que fue muy difícil mantener alimentado a ese chico. Cada mañana su mamá cocinaba una docena de huevos y 10 ollas de avena. Después de ese pequeño refrigerio, Paul estaba listo para el desayuno. Sus padres también trabajaron duro para mantenerlo vestido. Una vez al mes, su padre talló un par de zapatos de 2 pinos. Su madre usó la lana de todo un rebaño de ovejas para tejer un suéter a su hijo. ¿Cómo lo hizo? Ella hace los botones, cosió las ruedas de un carro.
School was not easy for a husky young fellow like Paul. By the 3rd grade, he was too big for the schoolhouse. So instead of going into class, he had to sit outside and peek through the window.
La escuela, un joven grande y fornido como Paul. En el 3er grado, él era demasiado grande para... En lugar de ir a clase, tuvo que sentarse afuera y mirar por la ventana.
One snowy day, Paul was walking home from school. It was so cold that his teeth were chattering and his lips turned blue. Why, even the snow was turning blue.
Recording in progress.
Soon the world wore a sparkly blanket of sky blue snow. Paul saw a strange lumpy hill. It had two furry ears. So he grabbed the ears and pulled, and out popped a little ox, as cold and blue as the snow. The boy wrapped his warm scarf around the shivering ox. Poor little Babe, he said. Later, Babe gave Paul a playful kick that knocked him on his rear just to say thanks.
Hacía tanto frío que le cascateaban los dientes y tenía los labios azules, porque incluso la nieve estaba volviéndose azul. Pronto el mundo se vistió con un manto brillante de nieve celeste. Paul vio en la colina algo extraño, llena de bultos. Tenía dos orejas peludas. Agarró las orejas y tiró. Salió un buey perdido. Estaba tan frío y azul como la nieve. El niño envolvió en su bufanda caliente alrededor del buey, temblando. Pobre pequeño, dijo. Más tarde, Babe le dio a Paul una patada juguetona que lo derribó. Lo derribó solo para decirle gracias.
That little ox sure grew up fast. One night, Paul put him in the barn, and the next morning, the ox and the barn were missing. Paul found Babe in a neighbor's yard with the barn perched on his back. By springtime, Babe was fully grown. He measured 42 axe handles from eye to eye. Some folks tried to reckon how long he was, but no one could count that high. Paul knew that he and Babe must be meant for something big. So he said goodbye to his parents, and Paul Bunyan and his blue ox set out to see the world.
Ese pequeño buey azul seguro que creció rápido. Una noche, Paul lo metió en el granero. A la mañana siguiente, faltaba el buey y el granero. Paul encontró a Babe en el patio del vecino con el granero sobre su espalda. Para la primavera, Babe había crecido por completo. Midió 42 mangos de hacha, de ojo a ojo. Algunas personas intentaron calcular cuánto tiempo tenía, pero nadie pudo. ¿Por qué era tan alto? Paul sabía que él y Babe debían estar destinados a algo grande. Entonces se despidió de sus padres. Luego Paul Bunyan y su gran buey azul se fueron a explorar el mundo.
Paul and Babe headed west. By lunchtime, they had already crossed over 7 states. Whenever the big ox got thirsty, Paul would stop and dig out a water hole. Today we call them the Great Lakes. After a few thousand miles, Paul began to get tired. He dragged his heavy axe behind him as he walked. When he stopped to rest, he saw that the axe had carved out a fine little ditch. What a grand canyon, he exclaimed, and the name has stuck ever since.
Paul y Babe se dirigieron hacia el oeste. A la hora del almuerzo, habían cruzado los 7 estados. Siempre que el buey tenía sed, Paul se detenía y excavaba un pozo de agua. Hoy llamamos a esos agujeros los grandes lagos. Después de unos miles de kilómetros, Paul empezó a cansarse. Arrastró a su pesada hacha detrás de él mientras caminaba. Cuando se detuvo a descansar, vio que el hacha había acabado una pequeña zanja y dijo, ¡qué gran cañón! El hombre y el nombre se ha quedado desde entonces.
It took Paul nearly a week to walk across America. He saw a great land covered in thick green forests. He saw men, women, and children traveling in covered wagons. These adventurous people were pioneers looking for a place to settle. Suddenly, Paul had an idea. Timber! He swung his axe and felled 10 trees in one blow. Timber! In a flash, he cleared 10 acres. He piled the logs on Babe's broad back. Now there was room for the pioneers to start planting crops and building houses.
Paul tardó casi una semana en cruzar América. Vio una gran tierra cubierta de densos bosques verdes. Vio hombres, mujeres y niños viajando en vagones cubiertos. Estas personas aventureras fueron los pioneros, buscando un lugar para instalarse. De repente, Paul tuvo una idea. Timber. Movió su hacha y derribó 10 árboles de un solo golpe. Timber. En un instante limpió 10 acres. Apiló su hacha y también registra en la espalda de Babe. Ahora había espacio para que los pioneros comenzaran a plantar sus cultivos y a construir sus casas.
After Paul invented logging, he was famous. Thousands of men wanted to work for him. So he set up a giant camp for his lumberjacks. He built the bunkhouse like a hotel, but it was so tall that the roof nearly scraped the sky. Some folks said the building was so tall, by the time the men at the top had climbed into the bunks to go to bed, the breakfast bell was already ringing. No problem, Paul said. The men can float up on balloons at night and parachute down in the morning.
Después de que Paul inventó la tala, se hizo famoso. Miles de hombres querían trabajar para él. Entonces estableció un campamento gigante para sus leñadores. Construyó un barrancón como un hotel. Era tan alto que su techo raspaba el cielo.
The head cook at the logging camp was a guy named Sourdough Sam. Each morning, Sam made pancakes on a huge iron frying pan. How did his helpers grease the giant pan? They tied bacon to their boots and skated back and forth.
El cocinero, jefe del campamento de madero, era Sourdough Sam. Cada mañana, Sam hacía panqueques en un enorme sartén de hierro. Como sus ayudantes para engrasar el sartén gigante, se colocaban tocino en sus botas y se deslizaban hacia atrás.
After breakfast, the lumberjacks were ready for work. Back then, the trees were so tough, it could take a week just to chop through the bark. To help the men work faster, Paul invented a new kind of axe. It had 2 blades, so the men could chop 2 trees at once. Babe hauled the cut trees out of the woods. At first, the logging road caused all sorts of trouble. It twisted and turned, and the men riding out met themselves coming back. So Paul fixed that problem too. He hitched Babe to the end of the crooked road, and the big ox pulled it straight.
Después del desayuno, los leñadores estaban listos para trabajar. En ese entonces, los árboles eran tan duros que podían tardar una semana en cortar la corteza. Ayudar a sus hombres a trabajar más rápido. Paul inventó un nuevo tipo de hacha que tenía 2 hojas. Así podían cortar 2 árboles a la vez. Babe sacó los árboles cortados del bosque. Al principio, el camino forestal causó todo tipo de problemas. Se retorcía y giraba solo por diversión, hasta que los hombres se encontraron con ellos mismos volviéndose a entrar. Paul también tuvo una solución a ese problema. Enganchó a Babe y al final del camino tortuoso, y el gran buey tiró de él.
Even the weather could be tricky in Paul Bunyan's time. One year it was summer all winter long. Another time, all 4 seasons came at once. The whole camp had a bad case of spring fever, sunburn, flu, frostbite. Worst of all was the year when 2 winters got stuck together. It was so cold that the campfires froze. The men tried to complain, but their words turned to ice.
Incluso el clima podría ser complicado en la época de Paul Bunyan. Un año fue verano todo el año. Un año fue verano todo el invierno. En otra ocasión, las 4 estaciones llegaron a la vez. Todo el campamento tuvo casos graves de fiebre primaveral, quemaduras solares, gripe y congelación. Lo peor de todo fue el año en que 2 inviernos se atascaron. Era tan frío que se congelaron las fogatas. Los hombres intentaron quejarse, pero sus palabras se convirtieron en hielo.
Paul's crew worked at logging for a long, long time. They roamed from coast to coast, clearing the land for the settlers. Whenever it was time to move on, Babe hauled the camp down the road just like an engine pulling a toy train. One day, Paul stopped and looked around and said, "My work is finished. I've done all I can do to help build America." Then he and Babe wandered off in search of new adventures. Some folks say they're still wandering. So next time you're in the woods, listen closely. Do you hear a low rumble? That just might be Paul Bunyan calling to his faithful blue ox.
El equipo de Paul trabajó en la tala durante mucho tiempo. Vagaron de costa a costa, dejando la tierra para los colonos. Siempre que fuera el momento de seguir adelante, Babe arrastró el campamento por la carretera, como un motor tirando un tren de juguete. Un día, Paul se detuvo y miró a su alrededor. Mi trabajo está terminado, dijo. He hecho todo lo posible para ayudar a construir Estados Unidos. Entonces, él y Babe deambularon en busca de nuevas aventuras. Algunas personas dicen que todavía están deambulando. La próxima vez que esté en el bosque, escuche atentamente. ¿Escuchas un retumbar bajo? Ese podría ser Paul Bunyan llamando a su fiel buey azul.
And that, my friends, is the story of Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox. Thanks so much, Carla, for translating.
Y esta, amigos, es la historia de Paul Bunyan y el buey azul. Muchísimas gracias por escuchar.
Thank you, Paul. That was wonderful. I've known about Paul Bunyan and Babe the Blue Ox my whole life, but I learned a lot from your story, so I
Great.
appreciate that.
Gracias.
Okay, next up we have Alberto, who's going to be sharing the spirit of the lake, or sometimes called the heart of the lake, I hear. And we may have lost our friends in San Lucas. Did anybody else learn something new about Paul Bunyan in that story?
I have to admit, I did in my research. Like you, Crystal, I knew of the legend, but I had forgotten some of the details of the fun story.
All right, I'm just messaging our friends in San Lucas. Wonder if we have anybody from Maine on the call who is wanting to claim Paul Bunyan.
Yeah. Gerald, Michigan might have a stake in that as well.
The Great Lakes.
Are you aware that there's any claim to Paul Bunyan?
I'm not, but I did notice that in your story, Paul goes from his hometown west a few thousand miles, and then he cuts out the Great Lakes so that the blue ox can drink. So I'm not quite as I consider myself a Minnesotan, but I'm afraid you kind of lost the case there.
Yeah, I get you. Wasn't very convincing, that's for sure.
I did not pick up on that. That is a good point, Gerald.
Right.
Okay, I see La Llorona is back. So I think
That's a good sign.
There's Alberto.
I've heard Alberto's story. It's worth waiting for if we can make this work.
Yes, absolutely.
Heidi apparently decided it was bring your mom to work day today, which is delightful. Nice to have you with us, Mary Beth.
Also, just a special shout out to Heidi. This was her idea to host this event. And I don't know if everybody on the call knows this or not, but Heidi is transitioning out of the volunteer coordinator role. She is pursuing her degree in social work this fall. So we're, of course, very, very excited to welcome Patrick and Hannah as our next program coordinators, but sad to see Heidi go. So she's just done such a wonderful job in that role, supporting visitors and supporting long-term volunteers, and pivoted so graciously with COVID and came up with so many wonderful ideas. So this is one of Heidi's last big virtual events. So great big thank you to her. And to see so many people on this call clearly was a wonderful idea. So we appreciate you, Heidi. And we're ready for you, Alberto.
Buenas tardes otra vez.
Hablen el micrófono.
¿Qué más sí? Ah. Sí, buenas tardes otra vez. Yo voy a contar algo que pasó mucho tiempo aquí en San Lucas y que, porque en esos años yo vivía con mis abuelos, pero éramos bastantes nietos que nos gustaba salir en las calles, salir.
Good afternoon again. Now I'm going to share with you my story. I like it to listen that stories with my grandfather because we were very restless children and we like it to go out.
Como decía, nos gustaba salir en las calles, ir al lago. Entonces, mi abuelo nos contó lo que pasó un tiempo atrás para que nosotros, pues, nos estuviéramos quietos siquiera por un día.
As I told you, we like it to go out the house, go to the street, go to the lake, and so our grandfather told us a story, afraid, and don't go outside.
Para contaros esta historia que pasó, y él nos decía, este es el Rukushya, decía, o en español se traduce el espíritu del lago.
Our grandfather gathered us together to tell a story, and in Gachiquel is Rukushya en Spanish.
Y un anciano pobre, y un día ella se fue a día
Very, very poor woman who went to the lake at noon.
y naja de barro que soy chiquete
She hid her yard and her jawal. Jawal is used they hold the heart to bring water at the lake.
bajaba y por llegar al lago cuando vio
The old woman went to the lake at the shore of the lake, and then she saw a big snake.
y ella se asustó mucho. Dios mío, decía ella.
Was so afraid when she saw the snake, and she says, "What is this?"
Pero ella inmediatamente quiso cambiar de camino y la serpiente venía. Seguía por otro lado y la serpiente lo seguía. Entonces, ella
When the old woman saw the snake, she tried to escape. She moved to the right, and the snake moved to the right too. She moved to the left, and the snake moved there too. She was afraid.
entonces ella recordó algo pasaba y recordó un tiempo atrás que ella también oía las cosas que pasaban y sacó su agual en su cabeza, extendió en el monte que estaba ahí.
The one part of the story is that she listened. So she remembered that she set her yagual or the blanket on the land.
Decía, es un secreto que voy a hacerle para que me...
It was a secret that I needed to do so a snake will not follow me.
Y escupió del
The old women spit down 4 times in the napkin that she had.
la serpiente era grande, también tenía un cabello, la serpiente,
The snake was so big and it has hair and has beard. It
y la serpiente se
she
para traerlo a la casa.
the old woman grabbed the snake in the to took it to home.
Llegando en su interior, oía él que decía que buscara una
While she was walking to home, says, look for a big pot to set the snake.
y en ese rato, para descansar un rato.
Then she went to sleep to take
Oía una campanita que sonaba dentro de la puso la serpiente.
in her dreams. She listened to the sound of a small that was ringing and ringing and ringing.
Y la sorpresa, cuando ella se levantó, al principio no le importaba, ella había traído, pero al siguiente día ella vio cajas llenas de monedas, de
To home, but then at the day, she saw that the pot was filling of money.
Entonces, también en el sueño le dijeron que tenía que tener la serpiente por
In her dream, somebody told her that she needed to have the snake with her during 7 days.
y resulta que durante esos 7 días vio ella las ollas de dinero, que ese era un encanto que ella encontró ser tan la suerte de tener ese dinero, ese encanto que ella tuvo.
Because the woman had 7 pots filling with money.
Entonces, muy caritativa, muy bondadosa. Contaban la historia o lo que sucedió. Por eso le dieron esa suerte, que se puede decirlo así.
She was a very good person, a generous person, and a kind person. So it was the reason that she received that present, to find the snake and get all the money.
Entonces, el abuelo decía, ten cuidados ustedes porque puedes barba.
So our grandfather always says, take care, because maybe the snake could appear to you, and the snake has hair and beard.
Entonces, uno de los nietos preguntó, ¿y después qué pasó?
And then one of the and then what's happened with the snake?
Entonces, la señora anciana sacó las serpientes en la olla y se fue al lago otra vez.
So the old woman took the snake pot and went to the lake again.
Y ahí desató la agua.
She the snake is free.
Con su barba.
Then the snake went to the lake, get a ear and the beard.
Y tuvieron una amistad o algo que se sintieron.
The snake and so when they separate, they feel sad.
Y la anciana quiso despedir mirando para atrás y también la serpiente como para dar de amistad, ¿verdad? Entonces, así terminó el relato. Este es lo que pasó aquí en la orilla, según lo que cuentan los abuelos. Como esto va de generación en generación, y contaremos nosotros a nuestros.
So the woman and the snake say goodbye and they turn their head, and it was one way to say goodbye. It was a story that happened here, and we have to tell a generation.
Muchas gracias por sus atenciones y fue un gusto para mí relatar este.
And it was this story. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, Alberto. If anyone was experiencing any audio issues, we'll make sure to send out a copy of Alberto's story so that we don't miss out on any details. But we're really grateful for you sharing and your time. I think when we have visiting groups returning, hopefully there's an opportunity for us to meet Alberto and Elba in person and maybe hear some of these stories, because it's clear that you're very skilled storytellers. So we're really grateful for you sharing tonight. Carla, I don't know if you caught that, but really just saying thank you to everybody. Does anyone have any questions? Okay, I think we're experiencing some technical and audio issues in San Lucas, but would anyone else on the call care to chime in with an anecdote or a story or a question or anything else that they'd like to contribute before we wrap up this evening's event?
Crystal, I would just jump in to say this. I have never experienced a culture that was so gifted at speaking extemporaneously. Everybody from 10-year-olds on up can stand in front of a group and tell a story. And I'm just really struck by the difference between a culture that's based in oral tradition, like the Maya culture, and a culture that's based in written tradition like ours. And their ability to just tell a tale is just remarkable. And I'm so grateful to have been exposed to that.
Had anyone heard the story of La Llorona or the Spirit of the Lake before? Both were brand new for me, so I appreciated hearing them. But I also haven't been to San Lucas before, so I don't know if folks have heard these stories before.
I think La Llorona is pretty widespread, not only in Guatemala, but other Central American countries. But I've heard of her. I've never heard a full story.
Have you heard any other details or iterations to that story? Okay.
One of our stove makers, Wilmer, at the mission, has seen La Llorona, or at least claims to have seen La Llorona. So I've heard a version from him, and he said he was throwing rocks at an old lady in the middle of the night that was stalking him. That was La Llorona. And I said, Wilmer, I think you were just throwing rocks at an old lady. And yeah, so it's kind of a joke that him and I had, but.
Hey, Patrick, while your video's on. Oh, sorry, Bill.
I was just going to say, I've also heard various drivers tell that story, mostly about seeing her late at night after they've probably been driving way too long.
Some possible hallucinations from being overtired. Yeah, Patrick, while your video is on, I was just going to ask if you wanted to introduce yourself quickly.
Okay, I'm Patrick Toomey. I was a long-term volunteer at the mission from August 2018 to March 2019, if I have my dates right there. And I'll be returning in 10 days. Yeah, 10 days now, as one of the co-coordinators, one of the new co-coordinators. So I'm really excited to get back and see everybody again, and meet all of you on this call. If I haven't already, I've met many, maybe even most of you.
Like I mentioned earlier, at this stage, we're planning on reopening the visitor program in January of 2022. So Patrick's going to be really integral in that being possible and supporting future groups. So if you have any visits planned or unplanned and you'd like to schedule one, you might have the opportunity to meet Patrick. So, all right. Any other anecdotes, comments, questions, anything before we wrap up tonight? All right. Well, thank you all again so much for taking time out of your evening. And thank you to our storytellers. We're really grateful for the opportunity to learn and hear from you. So thank you.
Thanks, Crystal.
Thank
Have
you.
a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.